Hello, welcome to Monday's lesson. If you're not watching this on a Monday, don't worry. This is the next part in the development of liberalism. Now, for those of you that have been following in the textbooks, you'll notice I've taken a very different approach. The textbook is separated by concept and then told you about various key thinkers and explained how they see those concepts to try and tell you the development at the same time. It then finishes with a sort of battle royale between classical liberalism and modern liberalism. So what I intend to do is finish my story of liberalism, the way it developed from the very earliest forms of liberalism, right the way through to modern social welfare liberalism. I cut it into more bits. And after that, you'll notice attached to the show my homework task, there is a chart to fill in. Now, the idea is that combined with the textbook notes, this video and the end of the development of liberalism will pretty much form the full suite of lessons for the week. So you'll have 4 hours worth of material to work with, including this video, which I'm assuming you're going to pause and move backwards and forwards in anyway. There is no particular significance to me wearing a Gandhi t-shirt, apart from the fact that I literally didn't put a shirt on earlier today. So I apologize. Home working sometimes means I don't wear school uniform. So confusion abounds, and not just from me. Mainly from me, though. It's got to be said. It's got to be said. So back to this. This is where we left the story. We left it with utilitarianism and the idea of sharing resources in a sort of simplistic formulae. And I went on about how formulae is actually a plural. So moving onwards, we come on to the giant of liberalism himself, John Stuart Mill. And also, on that note, Mary Wollstonecraft, but more on her in a moment. John Stuart Mill is often seen as the main figure of classical liberalism. Classical liberals often quote him, they often use him, he's their thinker. But it's worth saying that John Stuart Mill changed his mind. Remember, I talked a lot about him during utilitarianism, and I said that he thought things had to change from that you couldn't measure things by purely simplistic mathematics, that there were issues with that approach. People who use him are people such as Samuel Smiles, who you may or may not remember from our work in year 10 and 11 on the government responses to public health, eerily fitting given our situation. So the theory goes that human beings progress, that there is a march of progress model of history. Things get better over time. And that is primarily done, as I was talking about utilitarianism, by the eccentrics, by the weirdos. And they do well for two reasons. One, they're not crushed by the majority. And two, they have good ideas. And good ideas in the marketplace of ideas that liberalism prefers will always come forward if you allow them freedom to do so. So John Stuart Mill and others came up with the idea that human progress was predicated on being liberal. It was predicated on being free. The more free you are, the more you're able to make progress. This meant you had to allow political tolerance, because there's no other way of sharing ideas than by exposing them to the potential of critique and debate and argument, and then seeing which will work the best. If you remember, the good will out. Also, the state in itself was a problem. If I go back to, hang on, I'll turn my video off. If I go back, that's actually a photograph I took of Belper. If I go back to this quote up here, you get a feel for how liberals view the state. The state is an agglomeration, a consolidation, a concentration of political power. It's where sovereignty lives. And if you remember, it kind of takes on a life of its own, because the people who make up the state follow the edicts of the state. Me as a teacher, at the end of the day, I will act to preserve Ecclesbourne School. Even if I disagree with the way that it is run, even if I disagree with the impact that it has on students, at the end of the day, it is my school. It pays my wages. I work there. If school were abolished, or if it fundamentally changed the way it worked, then my job would cease to exist. I therefore have a vested interest in doing many things that I disagree with. On a fundamental level, the state takes me for its own, and I will exploit the power that it gives me. All power corrupts. So the power I have in the classroom to make you listen to me and to make you sit down and to give you the freedom to go for a toilet break or not, I will use those powers, even if I don't agree with my having them. And that is fascinating. I will police uniform. I will police behavior. I will police emotion. You've seen me do it, and I will do so gladly. And I will always refer to the system. I am a rule keeper, I often say. All power corrupts. And here we are, I'm giving you remote learning, and I no longer have any of those controls. Does it fundamentally alter the relationship that I have with you? Well, no. You're here to learn. You're watching this video because you want to know more about liberalism. And so you can argue that Lord Acton and the liberals, and the classical liberals in particular, had a point. The state makes people behave in ways they might not want to behave. And it does so as a kind of necessary evil. If you allow the state to become too large, if the state gains too much power, well, then it will start interfering with the right of eccentrics, the deviants in society, to come up with new ideas. It will halt progress. It will calcify inequality. Calcify is, if you've ever been to Matlock Bath and gone to the aquarium, they've got a calcifying well at the top. The minerals in the water are sprayed over various things, and slowly but surely they build a is it calcium? It's calcified outer shell. They essentially turn to stone, or they look like they're turning to stone. So to calcify something means to essentially clad it in minerals until it cannot change. And if a state is allowed to get too powerful or too large, then it will simply take the system that allows it to exist and calcify that system so that it can perpetuate itself. That is the worry of liberals. You've got to be really careful with the power of the state. So it needs to be limited. And a minimal state will lead to minimal regulation, because that's ultimately what you're after here. You're after some way of making sure that people can get on with what the free market desires. Now, this comes down mainly to economic arguments. At the time, you've got to bear in mind when this was being developed, the Industrial Revolution was kicking off. A number of designers and inventors and ideas men, and it was mainly men, were coming up with ways of changing the way the wealth system worked in the UK. You've got people like Arkwright up the road in Cromford, well, up the road from school, not up the road from here. And they were creating incredible amounts of wealth and doing so without any real oversight. And the big question was, should you actually bring in any kind of oversight? Do you need to force these people that are coming up with new ideas to, well, do anything? Surely the free market would mean that they had to look after their workers. It's more expensive to train new workers than it is to look after the ones you've got. But this led to problems, which I'll come on to later. John Stuart Mill was influenced by Mary Wollstonecraft. They spoke often. Mary Wollstonecraft pointed out that women, for example, were equally rational as men. This was an unpopular opinion at the time. The early liberals, and classical liberals in particular, weren't that fussed about different groups within a liberal system actually being any more or less powerful. They were more about the deviants, the eccentrics, the weirdos. The idea of a minority group being less well off than another group within society didn't really bother them all that much. So the idea that women weren't being as heavily represented in political life wasn't really a thing. Mary Wollstonecraft pointed out that women were just as rational as men. There were no real gender differences. She meant sex, but we'll come on to that. And as a consequence, she pushed the idea, not the first person, but arguably the most famous, that, well, women should be inculcated, brought into this political thought. The early working class movements of Chartism at this time, of gaining working class people the vote, were also very keen on getting women involved, a fact that's often overlooked or deliberately ignored. And so people like at St. Peter's Field in 1819, they had a women's chapter, that there were supposed to be speeches by women. It's one of the reasons so many women were, well, injured or killed in the Peterloo massacre. They were there essentially to push their ideas. St. Peter's Field is in Manchester. That's why I've got here working class equality, Manchester. This idea that you could leave the economy to itself, that the state shouldn't take too much of a role in regulation, that the good ideas will out, what's good for corporations is good for us all, you might recognise. And you'll recognise them as something that I have previously termed neoliberalism. And at the end of this task, I've got a chart for you to fill in that has a column for that. You'll find in the textbook there's a much larger section. Don't worry, I'm getting there here too. On top of this, therefore, to try and limit the power of the state and to try and limit the power of demagogues to pervert the powers of the state, they suggested there should be a representative democracy. So what is demagoguery? How does that even work? You might know the term already. You might have heard that being applied to various people. A demagogue is someone that might not have the best interest of society or indeed of anyone other than themselves at heart. However, they're very good at what they do. They're charismatic. They can sell themselves. And these people that are good salesmen, but aren't necessarily politically active or don't necessarily have the wider picture at the heart of what they do, they can dupe people. And if you have direct voting, and if you have a proportional system, then you're putting yourself at the mercy of people that are easily convinced. Take, for example, the 2019 election. What that showed very clearly was attempts to manipulate how people thought on all sides, some of them with more success than others. Imagine if someone came along with a very popular point of view, with simple solutions, none of which would work, and promised the people of a particular nation that everything would be all right if they just believed harder, and blamed all the problems in that country on other things. That person would likely end up with a great deal of power. All power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, i.e., if you have all the power and no one stops you, well, then what's to stop you using it for your own personal gain? To prevent this happening, the classical liberals in the UK argued that you should have a representative democratic system. There should be a stopgap between the wishes of the people and the wishes of the state to make sure that things happened more slowly. After all, this is after the French Revolution, where people took control of the government and then enacted things like the Great Terror. So to try and avoid that kind of abuse of absolute power by the people at the top, the harnessing of mob rule, representative democracy was decided upon. And the idea is you got the vote if you had a stake in society. One of the great problems of socialism is the idea that it tells other people what to do with their money, i.e. people with no money tell people with lots of money what to do with their money. Ask your parents, I'm sure they'll agree. And so, to try and avoid that kind of demagoguery, representative democracy. You vote for a group of people that then go to Parliament and they vote on things in your stead. The idea being they're a bit more trained, they're a bit more removed, and they act because they've got a stake in society, they have property, they have lots of land, they will behave in a much more considered manner and understand, well, where a tax is going to fall, they're going to fall on the most wealthy, and therefore we can't just give all the money away. The big thing that classical liberalism does is it births later this idea of neoliberalism, which is essentially classical liberalism with knobs on, and in many ways steps backward from what classical liberalism was trying to do. But to say that this was John Stuart Mill's idea and his brainchild is to sell John Stuart Mill a little bit short. He's living at a time where classical liberalism becomes more popular, but at the same time, there is a new thing coming along. Oh, I'll skip it. Libertarianism first. I'll come back to that thing. Libertarianism came toward the end of the 1800s. And it takes as its basis Darwin's Origin of Species. Remember, the liberals are very keen on rational thought, they're very keen on science, they're very keen on this idea of the good will out. So they keep their eyes on scientific developments. And when Charles Darwin posts his work on the Origin of Species, and he talks about natural selection, it follows that a bunch of liberals look at that and go, well, okay, if there is a natural selection at work in the world, then it's survival of the fittest. Now, it should be pointed out, Darwin never used that term, nor did he imply that that happened on a micro level, i.e. within species. What he argued was that speciation took place over millions of years, or sometimes thousands, depending on the amount of time in a generation, and that was, you're not deliberately heading anywhere. It's just that those that don't fit the environment best won't develop the same way, and those that fit it better will develop more. And so you end up with different species of finch with different shaped beaks, for example, eating different fruits and nuts because they adapt and develop to different food supplies. Some classical liberals adapted that to society and said, okay, humankind will adapt both morally and economically. I said both, didn't I? But I'm about to give a third. And socially, my apologies, to, well, any kind of system. And if you can't adapt, well then, you clearly weren't ready for it anyway. Natural selection will destroy you. And that meant if people were out of work or needed some kind of support, well, more fool them. And so enters people like Samuel Smiles. Samuel Smiles wrote a book called Self-Help, and in it he argued that to try and help people, to give them an economic incentive if they were unemployed or if they lost their jobs, would harm them in the same way as if you overprotected children as youngsters. If you overprotect children, if you clean literally every surface, then they never gain the necessary, way of dealing with disease. They don't, their immune systems aren't very good. They have to be looked after for the rest of their lives. They become frail in older life. Now, Samuel Smiles and people of his era didn't actually understand that. We're talking about epidemiology, we're talking about bacteria in 1861 and forwards, and they don't know about that yet. So we can put that to one side. What I mean is that if you are too protective of a child, they never take risks. And if they don't take risks, they don't learn new things. Samuel Smiles and those who read his book, Self-Help, applied that across the entirety of society and argued that if you tried to help people with unemployment benefit or retraining them or basically providing them any kind of safety net, then you ran the risk of them becoming hopelessly dependent on it. They didn't want to. It wasn't a conscious choice. Oh, I'm going to live on benefits. It's not like that. They said that if you gave benefits to people, well, then they adapted to the circumstance that you provided them with, i.e. they adapted to living with benefits. And if you tried to take them away again, well, then you'd cause them to fail. Now, remember, liberalism is all about freedom. It's all about allowing people to do the best they can. So, if you remove their ability to move forward and to think their way out of problems, what you've essentially done is acted in an anti-human manner, according to libertarianism. And so what you needed to do was remove the state entirely. This influences a group of people called the New Right. Now, if you're doing sociology, you already know an offshoot of their thought process. I don't mean the alt-right, that's something else. The New Right was a kind of extreme free market. Extreme! I can do that properly now. I can do it properly with the camera. Extreme! Sorry, that didn't zoom in and out. Never mind. Dreams. Where was I? Oh yeah, so it heavily influences this idea of an extreme free market. You leave literally everything to market forces. If it doesn't fly, if it doesn't produce a profit, it is not necessary and cannot be used. If it doesn't give a profit motive, if people don't buy it, then the idea is not good. So goes libertarianism. And on that basis, the state, as it makes no money, as no one buys it, as no one supports it in that way, cannot be a good thing. The least state the possible. In fact, ideally, you offer no state, and everything is left to market forces because it is survival of the fittest, and it's called social Darwinism. It has nothing to do with Darwin, but it's this idea that basically you leave the weak to be culled by natural market forces. And if that means unemployed people starve to death because they can't afford food, well, then they should have got a better job. If it means that people aren't helped and they die in health and safety, well, then the business will fail. And those that do it right, they'll do it all right. If the balance between health and safety and profit is such that some workers die, well, that's for the businesses to look out. Government shouldn't interact with that. Don't work for that business. Destroy them from market forces. But if you want and need what they provide, well, then it's your own fault, isn't it? You should have thought about that beforehand. So goes the theory. Everyone is free to fail in this system, utterly free to totally fail, because failure is born only of laziness. You've got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Now, it's actually an insult to this system, because you can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It's physically impossible. So I find it fascinating when people who espouse this kind of libertarianism use that as a genuine phrase. It's fascinating to me. Anyway, they argued that any kind of state welfare is excessive. But state welfare as it existed at the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s is particularly excessive because it provided for people. This is the time when people are starting to talk about the state looking after people from cradle to grave, which you'll recognise as being a Labour phrase from the 1918 Constitution and later used by Beveridge in his report. More about him in a moment. And they argued that this is excessive. And what it does is it encourages dependency. It encourages people to rely on the state for the basics. It encourages them to, well, essentially do nothing because the state will do it for them. Where is the impetus to improve your life, to do better by yourself if you're getting enough to get by? If the state provides you with money, why go work? If the state provides you with food, what possible reason would you have to better yourself? You could just carry on as you are. I don't know, balancing a beer can on your 9th beer belly as you hurl abuse and advice at some of the best athletes in the world on the TV screen. Well, in normal times, I suppose there's no sport on at the moment. Maybe they play the Xbox until their brain leaks out of their ears, teabagging their opponents. My apologies for the illusion parents who happen to be watching. In many ways, libertarianism leaks into something called anarcho-capitalism. But I don't think we need to know about anarchism, so I'll leave it there. It's a kind of anarchism people often forget about. It's a right-wing form of anarchism, and it's very, very popular. So that's libertarianism. The other outgrowth of this is, well, the situation at the end of the 1800s, 1870 onwards. People were in grinding poverty. You may recall year 9 when we talked about industrialization in history. If you don't worry. Sorry, it was year 8, wasn't it? If you don't worry, I'll talk about it now. You've got Doré's picture, that's the one at the top there, of the bottle sellers. And you get a feel for what's going on here. It was an engraving of people in a London alleyway. And I don't know if you noticed the small children there, but the tall man in a top hat is the father. The tired-looking woman next to him is obviously the mother and the wife, and their children are clustered around them. The one in a fair bit of light with that pretty-looking hat, take a good look. Doré was saying people were literally selling themselves in order to get food. Something had gone wrong. Liberalism was about freeing people to change society and humankind for the better, the march of progress. It was about allowing people to have the power and the freedom to come up with new ideas. But how many people with world-changing ideas were unable to enact them because they were busy trying to sell either themselves or bottles in a London alleyway, died before their time? Something wasn't right. So around about 1870, political thinkers began to think again about liberalism and suggest that maybe, just maybe, the state had to do more than minimal jobs. It had to do more than declare wars, prosecute wars. It had to do more than minimize taxes on the richest and allow for an environment of, I don't know, free buying and selling, the market forces. The market forces weren't working. Something was up. Something was wrong. Maybe the free market could work, but the people involved in the free market were hampering it, and they were doing it for their own gain. Enter T.H. Green. He argued that there was a social obligation, that everybody who used society had to acknowledge that if they used the benefits of society, they kind of had to keep that going. So people often say, I'm a self-made man, but they're not. No one ever was. They're taught by someone else. And by this point, the state was providing education, or the laws to provide education. Furthermore, they used roads and canal links and railways to transport goods. Now, all right, many of these were privately owned and privately produced, but they were done so by people that had been educated at the behest of the state. And they were able to do so with the support of the state that was able to get rid of people who opposed them or to force things through. In other words, there was an obligation to recognize what had been done for you rather than simply assuming that everything you did was for yourself, and those that failed because of their own social failings. In many ways, T.H. Green supposes, no, that's not the word, comes before and sets up people like Rowntree. Yes, that Rowntree, the guy that, the sweetie man, the guy that originally came up with Kit Kats before they were bought out by Nestle, but that's more of a sociologist thing, so I'll pause there. The point is, Rowntree did a study in 1901 called a study of, was it poverty, a study of poverty? I think it's just called a study of poverty. And T.H. Green kind of set this up before the evidence was there. And it proved basically that people who were working on the very lowest wages were simply unable to save any money. People say, well, if they saved their money and didn't spend it on frivolous things, then they wouldn't need support by the state. And what Rowntree's work proved was that that was impossible. If you were paid the lowest wages, then you literally couldn't work yourself out of poverty. It was impossible. Utterly impossible. Couldn't be done. T.H. Green set that up before it was a thing. And he argued that you needed a kind of positive liberty, not just freedom from, I think the textbook covers this, but freedom to, the freedom to do more with yourself, to self-realize. And self-realization would be at the heart of what new liberalism was all about. Allowing that march of progress by allowing people to discover what in themselves was a good idea. With this, you end up with proper equality of opportunity. Before this point, they've always assumed that everyone automatically had equal opportunity, but it became painfully obvious in the 1870s that this simply wasn't true. Some people did not have equality of opportunity. Oh, well, if they could go to a better school, well, they couldn't. It was either physically impossible because they couldn't get there, or economically impossible because they couldn't afford it. And therefore, new liberalism started instigating and agitating for some way of allowing people a better deal. Now, I say here it leads to Labour in the UK. It does. The early Labour Party comes from an outgrowth of new liberalism, but it also leads to the Liberal Party in the UK from something called the Whigs in the 1840s. And that Liberal Party will hold government. It leads to people like David Lloyd George, for example. And it leads to people that, well, it actually leads to Churchill. Churchill joined the Liberal Party because he was a free marketeer. And the Liberal Party took those free market ideas and suggested that the state had a duty to give people the freedom to access that free market. In fact, it was Churchill who came up with the idea of labour exchanges. We'd call them job centres. The idea of finding out where the work was for unemployed people to try and make sure their unemployment was as short as possible. Yeah, that was Churchill. One of the things he did really quite well. Odd that I'm recording this on the 8th of May. Make it that way. Well, it's Motorhead Day. You're watching this on Monday then, or later. Oh, it's got stopped working. Work again. Thank you. It's back. So it leads to Labour, and from there we end up with something called welfare liberalism. And this is liberals accepting the welfare state, largely because it's their idea. The fellow in the middle, well, literally in the middle, at the centre of the slide you can now see, that fellow is Beveridge, William Beveridge. And during the Second World War, he recognised that there were several things that needed to be done to improve the life and ideals of the UK population. But he wasn't alone. Before him, there had been David Lloyd George, and something that they did after 1909 was bring in the idea of the welfare state, that the state had to do something to look after the most vulnerable in society. And they brought in things like, well, you can see it in the quads up here. They brought in national insurance that allowed for sick pay, which up until that point wasn't a thing. If you went off sick, then you starved because you couldn't afford food or rent. That wasn't a good idea. It meant that there was expensive retraining of workers. So a short-term saving by the employer led to a long-term outlay, which they recognized that needed to change, but the employers were very reluctant to pay sick pay because at the end of the day, it seemed like money for nothing. After all, they aren't dead yet. So the idea was that less people died, less training, but how do you measure that? How do you measure lives saved? It's really difficult. So the government forced them to do this with national insurance. The employee paid part of national insurance, and then that was matched and exceeded by the employer. And that meant that there was an insurance pot, so that if you went off ill, you could then be paid for your time off ill. This led to other things like the Industrial Injuries Act. Now, Griffiths and Bevan, by the way, Britain's Quads, the first family album picture, were actually both Labour politicians. This is actually about what happened in 1945 to 1951 during the first Labour government, after the Second World War, I mean. And the implication here, it's illustration from the Mirror, a pro-Labour newspaper, was that they came up with the idea. Well, they didn't. It was a liberal idea in 1911, and they did other things too, like health inspections. You might remember, actually, when we were talking about public health, they were quite big on public health. They did old age pensions in 1908, though admittedly that was set at 72, which at that point was the average age of death, quite deliberately to save money. But you can see that Liberals accepting the welfare state, and then Beveridge coming up with the idea of what you needed to do with the welfare state to slay the four giants, was it five giants, to try and make society better. They kind of set the ball rolling into what will be Labour government in the 1945 to 1951 era, and indeed that general political consensus that will survive until 1979. Indeed, there was great Liberal success after 1940. Huge Liberal success in terms of their ideas. Whilst the Liberal Party faded, what they stand for and what they set going kept going for a long time. The National Health Service, the concept of tackling centrally health and public health, was a Liberal idea taken further, granted, by Labour into a form of socialism. More on that in a moment. But the concept that it was necessary is a Liberal idea. So while 1940 onwards, the Liberals have largely failed in elections and have been used by a bullet shield by both sides of the political divide over the years. I say both sides, actually mainly the Conservatives. You can look that up. I'm not. That's not a partisan statement. That is literally what you can historically view. Their electoral failure in elections has been matched by untrammeled success in their ideas. So welfare liberalism is a huge thing. Now, I said the textbook differentiates between modern liberalism. You'll notice I've not used that term, not yet anyway, and classical liberalism and neoliberalism. The idea of welfare liberalism would come under modern liberalism. So what about now? Well, modern liberalism is kind of welfare liberalism plus new liberalism, which you could argue I'm splitting hairs. They're pretty much the same thing. But the idea that liberal ideas are still key is obvious. You can actually see this. We've got decentralized government. Now, obviously, we have a very centralized national government these days. But look at the debate currently, for example, between the First Minister of Scotland and the First Minister of Wales and the First Minister of Northern Ireland and Boris Johnson. You might notice some differences in their messaging over the weekend. Now I'm recording this before Sunday. You'll view this after Sunday, so I don't know what Boris Johnson is going to announce, but it's interesting that it was trailed in the newspapers earlier this week as being liberation from lockdown day in all the newspapers. Funny how they all reported exactly the same thing, almost like they were briefed on it. But the fact that they had to row back, the fact that there is disquiet, proves that decentralized government is alive and well in Britain. That is liberalism. Remember, power corrupts. So you spread it out as much as possible, like margarine on bread. You scrape it and then you scrape it off again to make sure that there's not too much power. All power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And if you've ever had an unevenly buttered slice of bread for a sandwich, you know what the problem is. Whilst butter is a lovely thing, too much of it when you least expect it is not nice. Furthermore, the idea that we have constitutional safeguards in government, however much they're not written down, the concept that they exist at all, is kind of a liberal idea. The use of referendums rising over time, becoming more important, going to the people, getting that legitimacy and buy-in, that's a liberal idea. The Freedom of Information Act, the idea that government should be transparent to prevent the state from calcifying inequality and power structures, it's a liberal idea. The idea of rights for minorities, It's kind of a liberal idea. It comes from Mary Wollstonecraft. It comes from people like Isaiah Berlin. The idea that minorities' rights should not be defeated by the tyranny of the majority. John Stuart Mill term there. And you begin to understand that rights for minorities is kind of a liberal idea, even if liberals themselves don't always recognize that. Liberalism essentially picks up the pieces. It doesn't try to proactively go out there and stop things breaking, but it kind of tries to hold things together. So if there are cracks, it tries to pull those cracks back together. It tries to set them with some kind of glue. It doesn't try to proactively decide where those cracks might appear. That's more of a socialism idea. Nor does it try to make everybody push in a particular direction. If people don't want to be pushed, then liberalism will not push them. It'll just stop them falling too far when they fall. Does that make sense? So if they're on a tightrope and they fall off, liberalism is kind of the safety net, whereas socialism is something else entirely. So I'll come on to that later. There are some paradoxes, though, in all of this, and it's worth keeping them in mind. And I don't think the textbook mentions them by name, but it mentions them as a concept. Oh, it's gone a bit dark. Hang on, I'm going to pause and fix. Lights are on. So there are paradoxes. The democracy that liberalism espouses and the idea of even having and needing a state. Liberalism accepts that democracy can lead to bad outcomes, that you can vote for demagogues, and therefore the state is necessary to sort of stop the power of demagogues. But we've been saying all this time that power corrupts and the state itself is a calcification of power, and thus you end up with the paradox. Democracy is kind of a majority rule by definition. John Stuart Mill and other liberals warned against the tyranny of the majority, that things needed to stop the majority doing things to make the minority conform because you need those eccentrics and weirdos. Yeah, but they also notice that you need consent, that people need to agree. They need to have a social contract. Jean-Jacques Rousseau. You have to agree to hand over your sovereignty to someone who will act as sovereign for you. You have to be looked after. Burke and that idea of representation. We've talked about Edmund Burke before. He's principled in the context stand that you elect people for their moral views. You don't, whatever you do, tell them what to think. You don't get them to act as a delegate. They are a representative. Well, on one level, that's a very principled stand. Burke was making a very principled stand against slavery. On another level, that poses problems. It does mean that if you vote for somebody because you like their party's ideals or because you like part of their ideas, you also have to buy into everything else. And that can cause issues in government. It can cause issues with kind of representation, full stop. And that is a problem. So you might agree, for example, with the East Midlands politician who said that gay marriage was necessary in 2014 and that it shouldn't be opposed, but you might disagree with her view that a report on things like Russian interference in the 2016 referendum shouldn't be published because the only people who want to know, and I quote, are idiots. So there are problems with accepting one good idea and then taking everything else with it because of Burke's idea about what a representative is. These are paradoxes within liberalism. There's also the state itself. It is feared by liberals, yes, capital L. Mill himself said that the state is an issue. It can become overpowerful. It can stop things from developing. And yet, the classical answer was freedom of the market. But that led to problems and people unable to self-actualize. And thus you ended up with the welfare answer, where the state was there to provide help and a safety net. But that required an expansion of the state and the state to take on more roles and for that power to become calcified. In other words, modern liberalism argues that, yeah, the state can provide benefits, but you've got to keep watching it. You've got to keep an eye on it because the state can, do that thing it does and calcify and become dangerous and hold things back. Hang on. So, conclusions. Liberalism has a very long history. Its development is long and varied. However, I think you can see that these early forms of liberalism exist mainly to set the scene. You could argue that they become classical liberalism. Libertarianism has a place, and you might think, okay, neoliberalism as it currently exists might be more akin to libertarianism than it is to classical liberalism, but I guess it kind of lives between the two. New liberalism, welfare liberalism, that's kind of modern liberalism as defined by the textbook. And I can accept that. I see what they've done there, and I see why they've done it. They simplified my old development slide far, far more. I believe that liberalism is the big daddy of ideologies, that to understand all of the ideologies, you kind of have to understand liberalism. You might notice that therefore I've started with liberalism. It makes sense. Furthermore, it's the naked ideology. Both conservatism and socialism, the other two big daddies we need to know about, well, they borrow heavily from liberalism. They take a lot of the ideas that start in liberalism and they take them in completely different directions. You've probably already noticed where they're going. But that's the theory behind that. Hang on. And so we come to the end of the development of liberalism, according to me. In the textbook, you'll notice that it then moves on to a series of contexts and tries to argue that there's a debate between modern liberalism and classical liberalism. I hope that I've signposted them and helped to make more sense. But one thing I haven't touched on is the differing ideas behind human nature and how different liberal thinkers view human nature ever so slightly differently and therefore come up with their different ideas. And so John Locke, one of the earliest fathers of classical liberalism, argued that human beings were essentially selfish. However, they did have a concern for other humans. They noted the shared humanity that humans have. And as a consequence, you could kind of trust them to come up with good ideas because they were concerned for one another and concerned about themselves as a consequence. Therefore, his idea of individualism was shaped by his view of human nature as being moldable and malleable, and that you didn't need a state to do that. You just needed people to recognize the fact that they had a shared humanity. Human beings wanted to do the right thing, even if they needed nudging in the right direction sometimes. Mary Wollstonecraft took that a stage further, and she said, well, all right, all that's true. Human beings are rational creatures, but human beings are not divided by sex. Men and women are both equally rational. And as a consequence, all humans, not just all men, all humans are equally different and equally the same. That fundamental paradox at the heart of liberal human nature. Now, that's a big difference. Up until this point, up until Mary Wollstonecraft, liberal thinkers tended to say all men are equal, and they meant men. They did not mean men as an it's a general term for humankind. They didn't think like that. They specifically meant men. Women, of course, were irrational creatures. They were prone to hysteria. Hysteria comes from the Latin word for a uterus, just in case you're wondering. Hence hysterectomy. And hysteria, by the way, was treated, I can't tell you that on a public video, your parents will probably complain, but it was, no, you're teenagers, you can understand this. It was treated by developing the very first vibrators. So anyway, she argued that all humans were rational, that women were no different to men in that regard. And as a consequence, her view on human nature was slightly different to a lot of early liberals in that she assumed that women were included too. John Stuart Mill went further and he said, all right, all humans are rational. He was kind of influenced by Wollstonecraft. But he said that humans aren't fixed. They can change their points of view. They can go for better or for worse. And that's where he brings in this worry about the demagogue, that people's baser urges could be appealed to, that an emotional appeal would have an effect. Up until this point, liberals had simply assumed that appealing to emotion wouldn't work, that human beings were too rational. You couldn't pull the wool over human beings' eyes because they'd notice we're rational creatures. And so we are, to some extent, said John Stuart Mill. The thing is, human beings can be altered. They can be improved, but they can also be held back. And that is a key difference between him and his views on human nature and what had gone before. Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued that human beings were ultimately selfish, but had a recognition in their selfishness there was something good for all, and they would benefit from that. So John Stuart Mill has a particular difference. What does this mean? It means that he believes there is a role for a limited state to make people do better. The textbook puts it, human beings are capable of progressing to higher levels. John Rawls goes further, and he doesn't go further actually, he doesn't build on this, he subtly changes it. John Rawls argued that humans can be selfish, and they value individual freedom because it gives them the freedom to act as they will. However, he said, don't worry, charities exist because human beings recognize the humanity in others. In this regard, he's very like John Locke, but unlike John Locke, he specifically said human beings are not men, so he accepted Mary Wollstonecraft's argument that women were part of that process. And like John Stuart Mill, he accepted that human beings could be made better, that we could progress to higher levels. And he recognized the danger of emotional appeals. So he kind of takes all of the previous modes of thought and twists them slightly. Betty Friedan, and I haven't really talked about her, but she's a women's rights activist. We'll talk about her more when we talk about feminism, but the textbook has a section on her. Do have a look. She argued that culture was an affectation created by human beings. How can I explain that? We create society, society exists, but human beings also create how we interpret that society. We create our cultural understanding of the world. And that culture can take on a life of its own in the same way that the state can. It can create certain conformist modes of thought, and people will conform to those. So art and sport will create a mode of thinking. And she argued that is where the essential patriarchal mode of thought, that men were somehow better than women, that women were somehow second-class citizens. That's where it came from. That's why she said Mary Wollstonecraft had to say that women were rational, because something had happened with culture beforehand that had set up this idea that women weren't rational. It wasn't a natural thing. It had come from culture. And she argued that in the modern era, that culture could change too. She was borrowing from John Stuart Mill that people could get better or they could get worse. And therefore, the concept that women were second-class citizens, for want of a better phrase, was not destined to be. It wasn't something humans were born with, it's something we learn. And as a consequence, culture changes human nature. In that way, Betty Friedan is very similar to socialism, which argues that context creates consciousness, environment creates who you are. She argued that culture has a role in shaping what human nature is. So what you think of as being a fundamental facet of human behavior can come from culture, can come from outside sources. She argued specifically that the discrimination of women came from a culture that allowed that to happen. And again, the textbook makes this clear that we'll be talking about this when we talk about things in feminism. Now, there are some practice questions here. And one of them is, to what extent, to what extent do classical and modern liberals agree about human nature? Now, that's an important distinction. You don't have to take each thinker and develop what they think. You just have to look at what the actual modes of thought, the schools of thought are talking about, and you can see for yourself. Classical liberalism argues that human beings ultimately are best left to their own devices. Modern liberalism, being based on new liberalism and welfare liberalism, argues that the state has a role in making human beings better. There's a key difference. So what you do is you take different areas that we've been discussing, and you very clearly, I think, work backwards from what they say about how society operates to what they say about individuals and human nature. Hopefully that clears that one up. It's not as hard as it initially appears, and certainly not as niche as it first appears. Anyway, I've babbled quite long enough now. Hopefully this has been useful. I've signposted things to look for in the textbook, and I've signposted some ideas you might use to augment your notes. Like I say, this video forms part of 4 lessons work, and the Show My Homework section that this came from, the link you've got here came from, has 4 hours worth of work in there. There is a chart to fill in, and I'm also expecting you to finish making notes on the textbook. So between there were 2 hours worth of lectures last week, plus this, which I think is close to an hour now. That's 3 hours worth of me just yammering at you, plus an hour to fill in the chart, plus homework time to make your own notes. I'm hoping it's been useful. Do let me know if it's working. And if I'll take silence as consent, I guess. and I'll move on to, I think it's conservatism I'll do next. I'm doing the same order as the textbook to make things easier in the long run, and I'll do conservatism for next week. Thank you all for watching, if you have been. Do stay safe, stay at home, and we'll see you in school when we see you. I look forward to that day, but in the meantime, yeah, have a lovely, lovely day.